Callum Bridges was 37 years old the morning his wife held up his paycheck stub, laughed once, and said the number out loud to a room full of people who were not his family. He had just come in from the cold, still wearing the jacket he wore to every job site, worn at the elbows, practical in every way that had nothing to do with how it looked, carrying the faint permanent smell of sawdust and machine oil that 4 years of washing had never fully resolved. The check was for $200. It had come from a slow week following a delayed contract payment, and he had explained the delayed contract once to Simone, briefly, on a Sunday morning 2 weeks prior. She had nodded. That nod, it turned out, had not been the kind that stored information. Her sister was visiting from Nashville. Her sister's husband, a man named Preston who wore a blazer on weekends and talked about the market the way some men talked about sports, was seated at the kitchen counter with a glass of something. The room had an audience. Simone had always understood audiences. She did not know that the $200 stub was from a subsidiary pass through account Callum kept for small on-site consulting invoices, entirely separate from the operating accounts of Bridges Material Systems, the holding company he had incorporated 6 years prior. She had never asked about Bridges Material Systems. She had never asked about the IP portfolio, the 2 filed patents, or the licensing agreement with a regional builder that had generated $312,000 in royalty income in the prior calendar year alone. She had no idea. She had never thought to look, and she had never looked, because she had never thought there was anything beneath the surface of what she already had an explanation for. She also did not know that 3 years from that Wednesday afternoon, a Forbes correspondent would call Callum's cell phone to confirm the details of a profile naming him the #1 entrepreneur in sustainable construction technology in the country. And she did not know that on the day that issue published, she would call that same number 41 times. He did not answer once. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The alarm went off at 5:15 every morning, and Callum Bridges was always already awake. It was a habit he had inherited from his grandmother, Ida Mae Bridges, who had operated a small construction and repair business out of South Memphis for 32 years, and who had never once needed an alarm clock. She believed that the day belonged to whoever got there first, and she had made getting there first a discipline so ingrained it no longer required thought. She died when Callum was 19, leaving him a workbench, a canvas roll of hand tools, and a card she had written in her own handwriting and framed behind a thin strip of oak she had cut herself. It read, "Don't let the noise tell you what the work is worth." He had carried that card to every address he had lived in since. It hung above whatever workbench he occupied, and he had looked at it 10,000 times without ever needing to stop and read it again. He knew what it said. He knew what she meant. He made his coffee black and carried it to the workshop in the back of the house, a narrow utility room he had converted himself, with strong overhead lighting, clear organized surfaces, and a pegboard on the far wall where every tool had its outline drawn in marker, so he would know instantly what was missing. On the bench that morning was a prototype housing panel, a lightweight composite framing system he had been designing and iterating for 2 years. He picked up a caliper, took 3 measurements, and wrote them in the spiral-bound notebook he kept open on the bench at all times. Its pages filled with figures and cross-sections and the small marginal notes of a man whose thinking moved faster than his hand. He had come to construction at 22, straight out of a 2-year technical program, working residential builds in the Memphis heat. He was not the fastest worker on any crew. He was the one who asked questions about load paths and material behavior and the specific vulnerabilities that lived at the junctions between systems. He went home at night and looked up what he could not find during the day. He kept a notebook of those questions, and over time the notebook filled with his own answers, and over more time the answers accumulated into something that resembled a body of knowledge, and eventually the knowledge became the kind that was hard to find anywhere else. After enough years of that kind of attention, the gaps in the industry became a map, and the map became a business idea, and the business idea became Bridges Material Systems, a holding company incorporated quietly in Nashville on a Tuesday afternoon when Callum was 31 and had saved enough to file the paperwork correctly and believed in what he was building clearly enough to commit to it in writing. He had met Simone at a house party in Midtown Memphis when he was 28, on a Friday night in October when the weather had finally broken and the air had the first real cool in it after a long, hot summer. She was quick and vivid, the kind of woman who could read a room in the time it took most people to walk into one. For a long time, Callum had found that quality genuinely compelling. She had asked him, on their second date at a diner on Summer Avenue, what he was actually building. He had told her honestly and at some length, laying it out the way he laid out everything, carefully, from the foundation up. And she had listened with the focused interest of someone deciding whether a thing deserved more of her attention. He had believed, for most of the 7 years that followed, that her decision had remained favorable. They had married when he was 30. The wedding was small, her family's house in Nashville, 30 people. Afternoon light coming through the back windows. In the photographs from that afternoon, he looked like what he was. A man who was happy, and who knew he was happy, and was not performing it for the camera. The shift arrived as a tone, a gradual retuning of how she described him in company. A flattening of dimension. A habit of explaining his work in sentences designed to end the subject rather than open it. Her colleagues knew him as the contractor. Her sister knew him as the handy one. He heard these descriptions without reacting, the way an engineer hears a sound in a structure and files it for careful consideration without immediately touching anything. On the workbench that morning, beside the prototype panel and the caliper, there was a sealed letter he had received the previous week and set aside for the right morning. He picked it up, opened it with a thumbnail, and read it. It was a preliminary inquiry from a research team at Forbes. 2 paragraphs, professional in the spare, efficient way of people who sent many letters and had learned what could be left out. The researcher mentioned a recent trade publication mention of the composite framing system and the licensing model, and requested a brief interview at Callum's convenience for a feature on emerging innovators in sustainable building materials. He read it twice. He set it on the bench beside the notebook and looked at the prototype panel, and then at the card above it, and he sat for a moment with the particular stillness that came from knowing that something you had been building quietly for a long time was beginning to surface. He was not surprised. He had built it to surface. He had simply been patient about the timing. There was one thing that needed to be handled before any interview took place. He finished his coffee. Then he picked up his phone and called Vivienne Cole. Vivienne had been his intellectual property and business counsel for 4 years. She was 48, deliberate in speech, thorough in a way that never required announcement, because the results demonstrated it consistently. She answered on the second ring, and he told her about the Forbes letter. A brief pause on her end. I expected this would come. The second licensing extension got picked up by a trade journal last month. These things develop at a predictable pace. Another pause. How do you want to handle the interview? Carefully, he said. But before the interview, I need to talk to you about the business structure. I was going to call you this week about exactly that, she said, and her tone carried the particular steadiness of someone who had already processed the information she was now delivering. Your personal and marital assets still have commingled exposure in 3 areas. If this profile becomes what I think it might become, those need to be addressed before you sit down with anyone. How long to clean it up properly? Callum asked. 6 to 8 weeks if we are systematic. Longer if anything gets contested. We start this week, he said. No delays. He drove to Nashville 2 days later and spent the better part of a full working day in Vivienne's conference room on the 8th floor of a building where the windows looked out over the city's west side. She had prepared a complete picture, the current conservative valuation of the IP portfolio, both filed patents, the royalty stream from the existing licensing agreement, and a projection model built around the 2 additional builders who had expressed formal interest in comparable arrangements. She had printed everything, bound it, and organized it with the precision of a woman who believed that the documents were the argument, and the argument needed to be clean. The IP assets alone, at current market comparables, were valued at $1 million. With both expansion deals closed, her 18-month projection cleared $9 million. The composite framing patent had another 11 years of protection under current filings. The second patent, filed the previous spring on a proprietary fastening system, had not yet been licensed at all. Callum sat with the $9 million figure the way he sat with any number that carried real weight, turning it over, testing it, making sure it was sound before he accepted it as a working fact. Then he asked Vivienne to walk him through the 3 areas of marital exposure, one at a time, and the cleanest legal path through each. She did. The first 2 were straightforward. The third was more technical and took nearly an hour to resolve. When they finished, she folded her hands on the table and said, "Everything I am describing is entirely proper, completely documentable, and defensible in any venue. You built this. We are simply making sure the record reflects that with full precision." "Then let's make the record precise," Callum said. "One more thing," Vivienne said. She slid a separate sheet toward him across the table, the Forbes interview. "Before you agree to a date, I want the first 2 restructuring documents fully executed. That buys us a clean window." "Agreed," he said. He drove back to Memphis that evening in the particular quiet of a man who had taken a full accounting of what he had and knew exactly what needed to be protected and was prepared to protect it. Preparation is the work. There is no substitute and no shortcut for it. The restructuring took 6 weeks, and Callum moved through every step of it with the methodical care he brought to any project where the tolerances actually mattered. He met with Vivienne twice more in Nashville. He spent 3 weekends reorganizing his own records, cross-referencing account histories, and producing a personal timeline of the business's development that went back to the original LLC filing and accounted for every significant financial event in between. He did this not because Vivienne asked him to, but because he was an engineer, and engineers kept the kind of records that proved what they had built was sound. He also had 2 extended phone calls with Clyde Pearson. Clyde was 70 years old and had spent 30 years in banking before retiring to a small advisory practice in Memphis. He had managed his grandmother Ida May's investments for the last decade of her life, and when Callum was 22, Clyde had sat across from him at a kitchen table and reviewed a business plan that was more ambition than structure, and it said, simply, "The idea is right. The patience isn't there yet. Come back when you've worked it another 2 years." Callum had gone home and worked it another 2 years and come back, and Clyde had agreed to advise him on the spot. He kept his office in a 2-room building on a side street in South Memphis because he believed that having somewhere specific to go each morning was good for a man's thinking, and because he had no patience for the kind of meetings that happened in conference rooms designed to impress rather than work. Clyde reviewed everything Vivienne had prepared. He asked 7 questions across the 2 calls. All 7 were aimed at precisely the things that actually mattered: the valuation methodology, the patent term remaining on the primary filing, the contractual structure of the royalty agreement, and the specific language in the equity partnership term sheet that might create downstream complications. At the end of the second call, he was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "Your grandmother used to say that the work tells you what it's worth when you give it enough time. You gave it enough time." "I know," Callum said. "Then let Vivienne file what she needs to file," Clyde said. "Don't slow the real work down for any of this. The work is the answer." Callum thought of the card above the bench. He thought of 32 years of 5:15 mornings that asked nothing of anyone and produced work that was still standing. He thought of his grandmother and the 1962 cabinet she had refinished by hand and the patience she had brought to every joint. He went back to the prototype. He ran the fourth iteration of the thermal expansion test, and the numbers improved over the third. He wrote them in the notebook. He kept building. In the final week of the restructuring, before the last document was filed, Callum went home one evening and sat down to dinner with Simone, as he had done for 7 years. He passed the bread. He asked about her week. He listened to the answer. He watched her occupy the space of the ordinary evening with the same ease she had always moved through ordinary evenings, and he watched it without anger and without theater, only with the quiet attention of a man who had already decided and was simply moving through the remaining time before the decision took its proper form. She was performing for an audience of one who already knew the full show by heart. The same week the final restructuring document was confirmed and filed, Callum sat across from Simone at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening and told her he wanted to separate. He said nothing about Forbes. He said nothing about Vivienne or Clyde or the $9 million projection or the 2 licensing deals waiting to close. He told her only what was honest and necessary, that he had been paying careful attention to their marriage for some time, that what he had observed had brought him to a clarity he could no longer set aside, and that he believed it was better for both of them to acknowledge what was true now rather than continue past the point where continuing served any real purpose. Simone looked at him across the table. "This is about the paycheck thing. In February." "It was before February," he said quietly. February just said it out loud. He did not raise his voice. He had no interest in the argument that was available to him. He had made his decision the way he made every decision, after sustained observation, after full consideration, after sitting with the conclusion long enough to know it was not going to change. The only remaining questions had been the when and the how, and both of those had been answered. She had no idea what had already been filed. She had no idea what was already in motion, or what shape it would take when it arrived. He moved into a furnished apartment the following week and began working the longest hours of his career, with the concentrated energy of a man who had finally cleared the surrounding noise and could hear the work at full volume. The Forbes issue published on a Thursday in October, and the calls began before 9 in the morning. Callum was on the job site when the first one came in. He checked the screen, set the phone face down on the truck tailgate, and finished the conversation he was already having with his site lead about the framing schedule for the week. The phone lit up again 11 minutes later. Then again. By noon the count was 31. He sat on a concrete block with his lunch and looked at the phone without opening it. He did not need to read the messages. He had reviewed the proof the evening before, 12 pages in the print edition and considerably longer online, naming him not as an interesting regional figure, but as the foremost innovator in sustainable construction technology in the country. The piece covered the patent history, the IP portfolio, the licensing model, and the 10-year arc of quiet, deliberate work that had produced them. The photograph they had chosen was taken at the workbench in his apartment. In the background, clearly legible on the wall, was the framed card in his grandmother's handwriting, in the oak frame she had cut herself. By 6 o'clock that evening, the count was 41. He sat in his apartment with the phone face up on the table and watched the last call arrive and go to voicemail. He looked at the screen for a long, even moment. He counted the number deliberately, the way he counted anything that deserved accurate accounting. 41 calls. Not 30, not 50, 41. In 11 hours, from a woman who had stood in a kitchen 18 months ago and held up a $200 check stub like it was proof of something. He thought about that kitchen. He thought about Preston with his blazer and his glass of something, and the way Simone had known exactly when to hold the check up for maximum effect. He thought about the 7 years before that kitchen. The good years. The real ones. The ones that had preceded the slow retuning of her regard. He thought about all of it with the dispassionate clarity of a man who had already moved through the grief and come out the other side into something cleaner. He thought about Ida Mae Bridges and her coffee pot and the 32 years of work that had never once required an audience to be real. He turned the phone face down. He did not call back that evening or the following morning or in any of the days after that. There was nothing left in that direction that required his presence, and his presence had better places to be. Bitterness required ongoing emotional investment in people who no longer deserved it. Callum Bridges had never had energy to spare for things that did not build towards something. 13 months passed with a particular velocity of time spent doing the right work at the right scale. Bridges Material Systems closed both licensing expansions in the 4th month. Vivienne filed the equity partnership documentation with the Regional Development Group in the 7th, and the independent appraisal came back at $9.3 million, slightly above the projection she had laid out in her conference room on that long Nashville afternoon. Callum hired 2 junior engineers, expanded the workshop, and broke ground on a small production facility outside Memphis on a Tuesday morning in early spring, standing on site in his worn jacket while the first concrete was poured, staying until the pour was finished. The divorce was finalized 9 months after he filed. The restructuring held cleanly through every motion Simone's attorneys made. The marital estate settled to what it equitably contained, and nothing beyond that. He pursued nothing he was not entitled to, and he conceded nothing that was not correctly owed. He was not a man who took what he had not built, and he was not a man who surrendered what he had. The record was complete, documented, and sound, exactly as he had made it. He heard through a mutual acquaintance that Simone had left the marketing firm and taken a position at a smaller agency in a different part of the city. He received this information the way he received most information about things that no longer intersected with his life, clearly, briefly, without assigning it more weight than it could honestly carry. He did not seek further details. He did not think about it again after that. On a Saturday morning in early spring, Callum sat at the workbench in the craftsman house he had purchased in East Memphis and was renovating room by room on weekend mornings, working at the pace the work itself set and no other standard. The morning light came through the workshop window at the particular angle he had come to associate with a day that would go well, falling across the oak surface he had refinished with his own hands, bringing up the grain the way good light always brought up the truth in honest material. The card hung above the bench in its thin oak frame, his grandmother's handwriting as clear as the morning she had made it. A woman named Avery sat at the kitchen table 20 feet behind him, reading and not requiring anything from the room. She was a civil engineer he had met at a conference in Nashville 8 months prior, who had asked better questions in their first conversation than most people asked across an entire year, and who had told him on their third meeting that she found careful men considerably more interesting than impressive ones, and meant it as a distinction between two genuinely different things. She was present in the way that mattered, without performance, without calculation dressed as ease. She asked good questions when she had them, and kept her own counsel when she did not. And she was building something on her own time, in her own direction, and she understood what that required, and she respected it in him the way it deserved to be respected. She had brought coffee that morning, without being asked. It was black. She had paid attention. He looked at the card. He looked at the light on the oak. He picked up the caliper and measured the 5th iteration of the panel. The number was better than the 4th. He wrote it in the notebook and turned to the next clean page. He was still building. He intended to be for a very long time, and he had every tool he needed to do it right. Freedom was the real currency. He had never been richer. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.